I was happy to see that Dr. Collier had given you an overview of irreducible complexity a couple weeks ago. But I'm going to give you just a real quick rundown of it so we know what we're talking about. So, irreducible complexity, Michael Behe's definition, he says a single system composing of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to a basic function. Okay? And so the removal of any one part causes the system to be non-functioning. Okay? So you've got a system, it performs a function, it's got parts, all of them are required. Okay? That's irreducible complexity. Okay? So the goal of irreducible complexity is to say that if a system doesn't function without one of its parts, then a precursor system without that part would have trouble evolving to it. Because selection, the whole idea behind random mutation and natural selection is to have design without a designer, right? So they're specifically looking for a mechanism that is not forward-looking, right? So that's selection does not look forward to future function. It only deals with current function. And then if you select for existing functions, so if I don't have the part for a future function, and I'm selecting for existing function, my chances of actually selecting for what I'm going to need for a system in the future is very small. Okay, does that make sense to everyone? Everyone following? All right. So what's the relationship between irreducible complexity and intelligent design? Well, so you can think of irreducible complexity as an empirical definition of holism, right? When we think about design, we think about doing things holistically, doing them all at once. We think about the end, and then we arrange the parts to make the end. So it's a holistic thinking. And so irreducible complexity is what happens when a scientist asks, what are the features of something that we can know has this property of holism? Okay, so you take the big philosophical idea of holism and you say, okay, well, what is the way that we can test for this? Okay, so irreducible complex systems have to be made holistically. They have to be made with the end in mind. So that's where you get the parts. They don't come from selection because you can't select for them because you don't have the function. So a holistically designed system doesn't have to be actively functioning in the intermediate stages, right? When I'm putting together a car, it doesn't have to run at every moment that it's being put together. However, living things actually do have to be alive the entire time, right? It's a constraint of biology. If you have a period where everything dies, then you're not going to get any changes after that. It's dead. So a designer can do forward-looking selection. This is what breeders do. They select for things that they want because they are looking forward to the future of what they want. So a designer can do forward-looking selection, but natural selection can't. Okay. Now, my goal is to develop a new foundation for irreducible complexity. Okay. So part of these problems stem from criticisms that people have offered of the standard view of irreducible complexity. Okay. So the big one is that I agree wholeheartedly with Behe's intuitions about irreducible complexity. And in fact, the book Undeniable, which I think you all are supposed to read somewhere in here. Yes. So Undeniable is a lot about justification for certain personal intuitions. Okay. So it's a great book. I like more rigor, and the reason for this is because I like to talk to a lot of people who don't come from my own point of view. Okay. So in order to do that, I'm going to be talking to people who don't share my intuitions. Now, I have a lot of intuitions as a computer programmer, as an engineer. I come from an engineering family. We all know how to put things together. We know how to write code that works, and so that brings a whole set of intuitions, which I think are totally valid. But if I'm talking to someone who doesn't come from that background, they don't have a reason to follow my intuitions. So I need something that's a little bit more rigorously defined. So the other thing is that irreducible complexity only really deals with brittle systems, i.e. systems where you can remove a component and it fails. Okay, so there's a lot of systems that are evidently designed that are more redundant. They don't fall to this brittle effect. The other thing is that irreducible complexity doesn't lead to other biological knowledge, at least is the way it's formulated. That's a lot of people have asked Behe. They're like, okay, well let's just say what you've said is 100% true. How does that affect us? What are we going to do different in the lab if irreducible complexity is true? Anything? Well, if not anything, then it's an interesting idea. Bravo! I'm glad you had fun with it. But what are we going to do now? Okay. So as I said, if you can't build a better iPhone out of it, it's not true. Okay. So then I also had a personal motivation, and that is I was having a discussion at a creation biology society meeting, and there was a lady there who was doing research for a book, and we're having discussion over Darwinism and creationism, and so I just kind of nonchalantly said something to the effect of, Darwinism can't produce these sorts of complicated systems. Another semi-famous creationist was next to me, and he actually chided me for that. He said, no, you can't justify that position. And I was a little taken aback, and I was a little offended. But as I thought about it, I was like, well, I do see that I've brought in a lot of personal intuition on this. So how can I move this from personal intuition to public demonstration? So a similar thing happened. I was listening to a debate, the 1984 debate between Richard Dawkins and Arthur. I think Arthur Wilder. I think his first name's Arthur.
I think so.
Yeah, Arthur Wilder Smith. There is a famous debate. It's actually really good. They kind of got to the issues, but there was a discussion over there were certain changes that were seen to be beneficial, and the question was, were these actual changes, or were these rearrangements of existing information? Okay, and so Wilder Smith said, "Oh, those are just rearrangements." And Dawkins was like, "Well, what is a change except a rearrangement?" All right, so this is a good question, and so it's good to find good questions that people are asking, and then say, "Okay, well, how can we better define the terms here so we can better understand what's going on?" So the question is information actually being created, or is it being shuffled around? Okay. So my goal, I wanted to create a definition of irreducible complexity, which shows that Darwinism is not just unlikely, not just unevidenced. I wanted to show that it is logically impossible over a wide range of assumptions. Okay. So because as I said, as an engineer, I have this intuition that you can't design things without a designer, and if that intuition is right, then we should be able to demonstrate it. And if it's wrong, it'd be good to know that too, right? So, I wanted to be able to show the conditions for which evolution may or may not be possible, and then I wanted to take the definition, because we only, in America, we only believe things that can give us better iPhones. I wanted to show how this definition can be useful for actual biological work in the lab. Okay, and then I want to be able to put the definition to practice. Now, I'm not a biologist. I don't have a lab, but I wanted to at least paint a picture so that other people who might be biologists and might have labs could take this and run with it. Okay, so to do that, I go to computability theory. I'm a programmer. That's where I always run home to. That's a nice little picture of Alan Turing. So, why computability theory? Well, evolution, at its core, it's about mapping genotypes to phenotypes, and specifically mapping changes in genotypes to changes in phenotypes. Okay, so you've got genotype is what the genes say, phenotype is what the organism actually does. Okay, so in other words, there is a code which performs a function, and changing that code produces a change in function. Okay, and so there is a well-studied area of mathematics that deals with the way that changes in codes produce changes in functions, and that is computability theory. Okay, so real quick, brief overview of Turing's theory of computation. All right, so what Turing did is he developed a model of computation. Okay, and what's amazing about this model of computation is that it is as powerful as any other implementable model of computation has ever been invented. It's a very simple concept, as you see. I describe it in one slide, right? It's very simple, but this model can be used to perform any computable task, all right? And so, even paradigms of computation that look very different, all are equal in the ability to perform computational tasks. So, what his design was to have an infinitely long tape, right? This is back in the old days. You know, we use tape instead of hard drives. So think infinitely long, infinitely big hard drive, all right? And that stores both the program and the data. Okay. Then you have a read-write head. You have something that can read the tape, it can move the tape back and forth, and it can write on the tape. Then you have a state register, which is just a box that you can put in a temporary value, one of a fixed set of values. Then you have a state transition table, and this tells you if you read this on your read-write head and your state is this, do this. All right, so just to give you a quick example of what that looks like, here is an example Turing machine. Okay, so this is my tape, this is my read-write head, this is my state register, and this is my state transition table. So it says, if I'm in state A, which I am, I'm going to read the value, and if it's 1, I'm going to move the head forward 1 and change the state to B. Okay, so now I'm in state B, so we can pretend the B is right here, my read-write head is right here. Okay, so then on state B, it says if it's 0, move the head backward 1 and keep the same state. So I'm going to move it backwards 1, and I'm still in state B. Okay, so I read it again. If state B, if it's 1, halt. And I'm done. So that's what a Turing machine is like. Okay, so if I added in additional states for writing, for modifying, there's a lot of things that you could do, but you can actually perform any computable function that there ever is in the entire history and future of the world can be done with this idea. Okay, and so this gives us a very, what we need in science and physics and everything are small model systems, which tell us a lot about a lot of other stuff. So this is the small model system that we use to think about and create ideas and tests for computability theory. Okay. So then you have two different types of machines. Okay. We have special purpose machines that have a limited set of functions, and you have universal machines. Okay. So a Turing machine is said to be universal if it can compute any computable function just by changing its tape. So if you remember, we had that state transition table. So if we keep the state transition table and we can just change out the tape to get a new program, then that is a universal Turing machine. Okay? And every universal machine is equally powerful. Okay? They can all implement the same set of functions. They can actually also implement each other. So you can say this. This area of tape we're going to interpret as if we were this machine over there. So if you don't have a universal Turing machine, then you can only implement a subset of possible computable functions. Okay. So in order to not be limited to it actually winds up being a very small subset of computable functions. So if the set of needed functions are not known ahead of time, then you have to use a universal machine, because otherwise you'd be too constrained in what it did. Now, if you know the sorts of functions you need, then you can use a special purpose machine, and that's fine. But if you don't know your needs ahead of time, you will need a universal machine so that your tape can be arbitrarily changed. And I hope you're getting the idea right now that the tape is a lot like the genome. Okay, so if you change out the genome, you get a different organism. So, therefore, if biology is to evolve to environments it isn't aware of ahead of time, then the proper mathematical model for that is a universal machine. Okay, so that's the type of machine that we have to use for modeling if we're going to analyze evolution as it has to happen for neo-Darwinism to be true. Okay, so then we get into Stephen Wolfram. Okay, Stephen Wolfram did a lot of his work on universality. Okay, he wrote a giant book called A New Kind of Science, and where he goes into this in great depth. Have you all ever used the program Mathematica? Okay, he invented that. Right, that's his baby. So he classified. He was technically not using Turing machines, but they're kind of an equivalent thing called cellular automata. But he classified these machines into 4 different classes. Okay, based on, and this classification was based on the relationship of change to the tape to the change to what the tape output, right? So the change of the input to the output, the change of the genotype to the way the phenotype changes, okay? And class 1 machines are machines that tend to converge onto a single result no matter what the initial conditions are, okay? So no matter what the tape says, we're going to, it's usually going to wind up outputting the same or similar results over a large variance of what's on the tape. Class 2 machines are machines that give relatively simple and predictable results. Okay? So if you change the initial values, you have a limited and predictable set of changes to the output. Okay? So those are class 2 machines. Class 3 machines, you actually can't predict on an individual basis what the changes to the input are going to affect the output, but you can statistically. You can come up with statistical averages, things like that. Okay, but class 4 are machines where the results of changing the initial conditions, changing the tape, are not predictable either individually or statistically. Okay, so when you change an initial value, it affects an arbitrary number of resulting cells on the tape. All right, so there's not a predictable relationship between the way that you change the input and the way that you get the output. Okay. So as we go up in class, we get more and more degrees of freedom, but we also make the relationship between the input and the output more difficult. Right? At the very beginning, it's very predictable. Class 1 and class 2, it's very predictable how the changes in the input are going to affect the output. Class 3, it's a little bit more difficult, but we can at least know it statistically. Class 4, there is no calculatable way to go from changes in inputs to changes in outputs. And interestingly, it is only in class 4 systems in which universal computation can occur. Okay, so that's very important. You can only get universal computation in class 4 systems, where the mapping between changes in initial values and the changes in the resulting function are not predictable. Okay? So, what does this have to do with evolution? Okay? So, universality, this thing on universality has an interesting effect on natural selection. Because when we increase the class, we yield more degrees of freedom, but we make the relationship more chaotic between the changes in our input and the resulting function. Okay, so we're making it's more chaotic. Okay, we have to have class 4 systems for universal computation, and as we said earlier, that evolution, since it doesn't know what sorts of environments it has to evolve to, requires universal computation. So, therefore, if evolution were to occur, it would need a class 4 complexity system for the changes in the genotype to give us the changes in the phenotype that we need. But this is where the rubber meets the road. For natural selection to operate, you have to have a smooth pathway of increasing function, right? So we have to have where gradual changes are also going to give us changes in function in the same direction. Okay, that is the only way that natural selection can operate. However, class 4 systems, since they're chaotic, since the changes in input have an asymmetric relationship to the change in output, they cannot, in principle, provide such a pathway. It is not possible, in principle, for them to provide a selectable pathway through this area. Therefore, the two requirements for evolution, and by evolution I mean, neo-Darwinism, that the whole, microbes demand. The two requirements for evolution, that we have universal computation and a selectable pathway, are mutually incompatible. Okay? So that, yes?
Could you expand on premise 4 a little bit? You say that for natural selection to operate, there has to be a smooth pathway. Can you explain that?
So it's not, and smooth is probably not the best word there. It has to be a directionalized pathway. For example, imagine that you're running up a hill. Okay, if there is a chasm that it's 100 feet across, I can't make it any further up the hill, right? So it has to be the selection has to all occur in one direction. Okay, if there's a giant chasm, I can't go past it. Okay, and so and so what happens in a chaotic system is that it forces the terrain to be crazy, so that the selection, you can't go through there because there's death on all sides of important function. Okay. Now that's the way that I've laid it out here is a little. I don't know the word for it. It's a little perhaps oversold. Because most of the time you have multiple levels of complexity operating at the same time. Okay, so because even within a class 4 system, there are areas of both chaotic and non-chaotic behavior. Okay, so even in chaotic systems, there are aspects of it which are non-chaotic. Okay. Also, because they are universal, a class 4 system can be used to implement other Turing machines, including other Turing machines of other classes. So I can write my tape in such a way that if I have a class 4 complexity machine, I can write my tape in such a way that certain parts of the tape will act more like a class 1 or class 2 system than the rest of the tape. Okay. So you can actually use, within a class 4 system, you can have parts of the tape act like other smoother, more well-defined, more predictable systems. Okay? But this limits the scope of selectable parameters to those which are implemented to be more like class 1, 2, and to some extent class 3 systems. So the way that I like to say this is that evolution, to the extent that it occurs, tends to be parameterized. There are parameters through which evolution tends to occur. In fact, this is being the evidence for this just keeps on piling up. We keep on having these recurring variants that happen over and over. I think just recently there is an article on whether or not evolution is predictable. Well, it's only predictable if there are parameters through which it is evolving. Okay. In fact, one of the most common types of mutations in your biology are the addition and removal of repeat elements. Okay. Now, a long time ago, people thought repeat elements were just junk, but it turns out that one of the main uses of repeat elements is as control knobs for functions. So there aren't actual knobs, so what it does is it tunes function by adding and removing repeat elements. And so basically there is a way that the organism has smoothed out changes, made these places where there are smooth, selectable areas of change that can be easily modified. Okay? So, redefinition of irreducible complexity. Okay? So to implement the arbitrary complexity within biology, biological systems must be class 4 systems. A hard problem, for this definition, is a problem for which a solution only exists utilizing the chaotic space of a class 4 system. If a class 4 system needs to solve a hard problem, it cannot do so through a process of selection because the chaotic nature of the system will prevent selection from pointing in any specific direction. Therefore, the chance of hitting a correct solution of a hard problem is equivalent to that of chance, since selection cannot direct the results. Okay? And even Richard Dawkins will say that randomness cannot produce what we have. That's why Dawkins and those people are so adamant about selection, because everybody knows that you can't produce these things by chance. They have to be directed by something. And so what we're saying is that for the hard problems, the chance of hitting them is equivalent to chance because you can't select them because there's not a smooth path. Information theory tells us that we will have a difficulty that increases exponentially with the size of the shortest solution, which is something that you should get from Undeniable. He goes into that a lot. But you quickly, very quickly have these, we have things that increase exponentially, you quickly cover so much terrain that you can't possibly cover. Okay? So solutions to hard problems can be achieved only if the system has prior programming which guides either the mutation or the selection through that area. Okay? So an irreducibly complex system is a system which utilizes necessarily the chaotic space of a class 4 system to implement a function. The existence of an irreducibly complex system is evidence of design because design is the only known cause which can navigate the complexity of a class 4 system to implement functionality. So, some examples. In computer programming, class 4 chaotic spaces occur when an open-ended loop is used, like a while loop. So here, I don't know if any of you have experience with computer programming, but this is the factorial function. And so you say, if you're given an x, if you want to know how to compute factorial, well, while x is greater than 1, we multiply the result times x and then decrease x. And then we keep on going until as long as x is greater than 1, and then we return the result. Okay? So the way to think about it is that think about the way that this would evolve, right? So if we had, if we had this as the wrong number, so x is greater than 1, if we had it as x is greater than 2, right? Well, all of a sudden, all of our answers are going to be off by half, right? And that's only being off by 1 digit, okay? If we don't decrease this the right way, it's going to just be wrong. If we don't use the right operation here with the right variables, it will just be wrong, okay? There's not any, none of these get you closer and closer to function. They're all just completely wrong. For example, if I said, while x is less than 1, I'd never get a result at all. If I had said, while x is greater than 3, I'd never get a result that made any relationship to reality. So all of these things, if any of them change, I simply have a not working program. Okay? So in biology, a very similar system is when you have negative feedback loops. So x produces y produces z, and then z shuts off x. Okay? And the problem with this is that if you have any small change in any of these systems, x is never shut off, right? Because if x has a problem producing y, then this whole chain gets lost. If y has trouble producing z, z doesn't get made, so it can't shut off x. And if z changes a little bit, it doesn't have the proper look to turn off x. And if x changes a little bit, it's going to change what z needs to shut it off. Okay? So then you have something that's happening without out of control in your cell. Okay? So this weak linkage between x and being able to shut off x is what causes an irreducibly complex system. And so we can see the results of what happens when these things don't happen in biology because you get things like cancer. What is cancer? Cancer is when your body can't shut itself off from multiplying. Okay? So small changes will cause dramatic nonlinear results because of the failure to turn off X. So whatever X is doing, it's just going to keep on doing that, even though it needs to be shut off. So a specific example is in the flagellar assembly. There's a transcription factor, and it regulates a number of proteins. And downstream from those, you eventually wind up with a product called FLEN, and that deactivates the production of FLEQ. Okay? So this is something that happens in biology regularly. I just wanted to show you an example so you know it was true. Yes?
Does this also apply to a system such as blood clotting?
Probably. I haven't looked into it.
Okay.
So they've actually investigated what the results of not having this deactivation, and the flagellum doesn't build properly. Usually what happens is actually you get multiflagellation, where you have cells that have lots of flagella, and they can't move because they have too many flagella. So this is just one tiny piece of the system. Okay? So, detecting design. Okay? So, it's one thing to say things like this. It's another thing to actually prove your case on a specific example. So have you all ever heard of the Avida program? Avida? You've heard of Avida. Okay, so Avida was this idea that, when Behe came out with Irreducible Complexity, a group of researchers decided that they wanted to test irreducible complexity in computers. Okay, so what they did is they built a system that was actually a universal computer. It's one of the first ones. A lot of times when you hear about genetic algorithms and all that stuff, they actually aren't using universal computers. That's usually the reasons why the ones that are successful is because they actually aren't using universal computers. So they can only evolve in specific directions. So Avida is a digital evolution simulator. So they have a self-replicating digital organism. So the organism actually contains the code for its own replication. And it undergoes mutation and selection. So the copy procedure isn't 100% faithful. So it was developed to show that IC systems can, in fact, evolve from precursors. And depending on how you tweak the definitions, this is why I don't like Behe's definitions, because there's a lot of different ways you can tweak them. You could arguably say that Avida created irreducibly complex systems. So this makes Avida a great test case. In fact, that's one of the reasons why they got the publicity that they did when they released it, is because it was thought to be an example refutation of Behe. So it makes a great test case for our improved irreducible complexity formulation. So, is the programming language of Avida a class 4 system? Yes. Do any of the evolved Avida programs require the use, or even use the use, of chaotic spaces in class 4 systems? The answer to this is actually no. I've looked into this quite a bit. The solutions that they are trying to solve are solutions that do not require open-ended loops or negative feedback. In fact, I've actually, in the forums, they talk about how hard it is even to get a loop that does nothing. Okay? So they can't even get a loop that does nothing, much less to do one that contributes to function. Okay? So therefore, the evolved Avida programs are actually not irreducibly complex. And as they say on the TV shows, but wait, there's more. All right? So Avida actually does have an irreducibly complex system. It has one. Okay? And it's the replication loop. And that is the actual code in the Avida language. Each of those are instructions. It's the actual code for the replication loop. It's an irreducibly complex system. But it didn't evolve. It was created. The people who designed Avida designed that and put this replication loop in the first starting organism. The program doesn't work if the organisms aren't designed with the replication loop in the organism. Okay? So you actually have the ability to take this and detect the design. For people who are thinking that they are showing the world this is evolution in action, you can actually look and say, oh look, there's the design. I was able to detect it. Avida actually provides a test case of both sides of the irreducibly complex formulation. It shows that things that did evolve were not irreducibly complex, and it shows that things that were irreducibly complex were the products of design instead of evolution. Okay. So then I also said we want to be able to use it in the lab. Okay. So, so with this definition, we can at least potentially use it, and this is the way that I envision it being used. Okay, so our definition is that organisms actually can navigate class 4 chaotic space if it contains information about how to do so. So it can either contain information about how to generate changes to navigate this space. It's like running uphill with a pogo stick or some other better device to leap over chasms, right? Or information about how to select the results from this space. Okay, so either one. So this would not be natural selection, and there's actually, I actually just released a talk on this. There's actually a whole lot of things in biology that are selection, but not natural selection. So therefore, if we have experimental evidence, and I focus on experimental evidence because people claim all sorts of things have evolved. The question is, have you seen it evolve? But if you have experimental evidence of an organism evolving within a class 4 chaotic space, so you have something where it develops a new negative feedback loop, then that is evidence that there is another repository of information waiting to be discovered. So that tells us, if we see that happen, if you were in the lab and you see, oh my gosh, this evolved a negative feedback loop. Well, we can know from this formulation that the way that it had to happen is there had to be information directing it. So we now know that there's something to look for. We know that there's a repository of information in the organism that we haven't found yet. So we need to go looking for it. So this formulation gives us the justification for both when we can be satisfied with saying, oh, maybe it evolved, where we also prompt us to say, hey, you need to look into this further. So I know I threw a lot at you. But the fire hose is complete. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
Do concepts like epigenetics play anything into that?
So epigenetics, to some extent, you can view epigenetics as simply being an extended part of the genome. I mean, it isn't actually physically composed of DNA, but you can think of it as the extended hereditary structure. So it would fall under the same computational rules. Epigenetics does operate differently because the system itself treats it a little differently. It oftentimes, you can think of genetics as largely being kind of like a computer's ROM, but a slightly changeable ROM. And you can think about epigenetics as kind of being the RAM in your computer, the extra memory that just kind of has its current state. They're both heritable, but the epigenetics is a lot more fluid. So, but it doesn't actually change the general considerations of the complexity. Yes?
Can you publish this work anywhere? And if so, like, has there been criticism that's been raised against it?
Yeah, so this is based on a paper I did for the Creation Biology Society. The paper, I believe, is called something to the effect of Irreducible Complexity and Relative Irreducible Complexity Foundations and Applications. I actually have all of my technical work is at blitheinstitute.org, I kind of have two sections. I have a section on variation in the genome, which this is under, and I have a section of talking about the mind. So, which actually is very interesting, very related to this, because you can actually take these concepts and just flip them a little bit, and you can use it to talk about the role of the mind in computer science. Right? So this isn't just about biology. This is general ideas about complexity and how they're navigated. Okay? So we can do that because we're not just physical beings. Right? We're spiritual beings, which is what gives us the ability to be creative, which gives us the ability to design, and we can detect our own design. Then we can use our design detection for doing things like managing software complexity. You know, we think about design as being this amazing thing out there that we're going to discover, but I'm a practical guy. I have deadlines, I have budgets, and I look for tools that can help me manage project complexity. And so this can tell us what parts of your computer program require creativity and which parts of the computer program don't. And so you can use that to manage changes. You can use that for all sorts of things. Yes?
I think if Dawkins was here, I would think that he might say something about how there's a stark difference between mutations being chaotic and random and natural selection not being random. So like within a system, you have inputs and outputs.
Right.
And those are random, but then natural selection is directed towards what survives. So that's an inherent non-random process. So what would you say?
Right. So that, I always kind of point out, so what selection requires, though, is that the changes in the genome, right? It requires the changes in the genome that as they get closer to the destination, that they get more and more selectable, right? So that's what it requires. It requires that as it gets closer, it's more selectable. As it gets farther away, it's less selectable. But in a chaotic space, that isn't true. So in a chaotic space, you could be getting closer and it being less selectable. Okay, and this is one thing. Like I actually think, I think if Dawkins has the Weasel program, and Weasel program's been given all sorts of, been lots of discussion over how legitimate that is. But one thing that I'd like to point out is that if you take the Weasel program, are you familiar with the Weasel program? Okay, so the Weasel program is start with a bunch of random letters, okay, and he has this phrase called "methinks it is a weasel" or something like that, and he chooses the letters to stay, which match the final word, the final phrase, or he selects the phrases, the word things which continue to get closer and closer. All of them can mutate, but he selects them as they get closer and closer. But the problem is that for the first, I don't remember, 5 to 6 rounds of selection, all of them are gibberish. None of them are less gibberish. They might be closer to his destination, but none of them are less gibberish. And so, for his selection to work, it actually has to be forward-looking, because he's navigating the space that's all complete gibberish, and he's not actually getting any closer to his destination. Yes.
So I assume you've heard of the neural networks evolution.
The what?
The new way of trying to create neural networks, the evolutionary technique, where they have a sample space and then they select.
Right.
Do you think it's the same process by which they do that? It's still forward-looking selection?
So on almost all of those cases of digital evolution, it isn't that it's forward looking. It's that they're all parameterized. Okay. So like if you take a look at any of and I actually had a friend who doubted me on this because I hadn't really looked at the literature, but he's a PhD computer scientist. What? No, it's Winston, his student. So anyway, he actually went through and he tried to find examples where someone could evolve a system that included an open-ended loop, and could not find it. So now technically, even by the formulation, it's theoretically possible. It's just very improbable because it's an exponential problem. But he couldn't find a single one. So it's not so much that they're forward-looking; it's that they are choosing, they are parameterizing their problems so they don't have to cross the chaotic space. The biggest input for any genetic algorithm ever, the biggest input for any sort of digital evolution is the parameter space. Okay, most people just assume the parameter space. We're going to modify this, and modify this, or modify this, and see if it works. Okay. I mean, that's a legit process, but it doesn't model evolution because evolution has no idea what its parameters should be. If you're looking for evolutionary idea. It has no idea. Like, so if I were to try to find, they've done this thing where they find an antenna, and the best antenna they had has this really odd shape, and they found it via a evolutionary type mechanism. They took a shape, they calculated the frequency response, they made a bunch of random changes, they kept the best one, they changed it, made a bunch of changes, and they wound up with a very funny looking antenna, but it actually is really great for their application. Okay? The thing is that it took engineers to know what should be modified, right? They were modifying the length and shape of the antenna. They weren't modifying its color. They weren't modifying what material it was. They were only evolving in the space where they knew that the answer existed. So they had parameterized their evolution. So they had constrained it so that it actually works. And that is the biggest input for any evolutionary process is the parameters that people put into it. So, yes?
Would you argue that these parameters actually exist in biological systems today? And
Yes.
Those parameters, by their own existence, that there is a limit to what evolution does, that is itself evidence of a design?
I would say yes on all of those. The one thing that I would be a little cautious of is I wouldn't quite use the word limit, right? Because a limit implies to people a fixed space. I mean, I think it's correct as far as it goes. The thing is that you can have kind of open-ended limits. So like if I say, we're going to vary x. Well, I don't have to say we're going to vary x between 0 and 100. I can let x free flow as long as we want, as long as I have a system that responds well to x flowing like that. So some of these are unbounded. There's not a specific bound to them, but they are all parameterized. In fact, there's a great book. If any of you are in biology, any people in biology here? A couple? All right. The book I suggest to you is a book called The Implicit Genome. Okay? And it's a great book on specific mutational processes in biology that are parameterized. So, all right. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate you having me.